I actually look at work as a spiritual practice for all of us. And it's really about our intention. You could have the most sort of cookie cutter, boring on the surface kind of corporate job where you feel like you sell your soul to do it, but you could bring an enormous amount of yourself and passion and inspiration to it. Or you could have the most incredibly inspiring looking business that you started on your own and you grew and it's fantastic and it's a full expression of who you are. And you could be miserable because as someone who's done something that I absolutely love for all these years, there are times during this that I've absolutely loved every minute of what I'm doing. And there's other times where it's been awful. And the only difference is me and how I'm relating to it or what's going on. And so I say that because it comes back to like at the core of my work, it's really about like, we're at choice. We're the source, if you will, in our human experience of how it is for us.
Aside from my soul. Welcome to the Inspired Evolution, and it is a treat. It's a treat for your whole self. Here today, we have with us Mike Robbins. Mike, welcome, brother.
Hey, man, thanks. That's definitely one of the most passionate openings of a podcast I've ever heard. I love it.
Passion and purpose is how we roll around here, man. Thank you so much for reflecting that back to us. For those tuning into Mike for the first time, guys, you are in for a treat. His recent book is We're All in This Together, and you guys know me, connection's my highest value, so I already love it. He is an author, thought leader, and he's well sought after as a speaker. He's teaching people and leaders how to infuse their lives and their businesses with their entire authentic self and bringing that to the workplace, to the work that they do. Doesn't always have to be within an organization, can be your own little organization that you create on the side, but it's about you showing up. There's appreciation that we can go into. There's authenticity that we can go into. There's connection. There's empathy. There is so much we can talk about in the ground that we can cover today. So let's hit the ground running from that point there, Mike. Like, there is so much goodness in your work, and it is so, I'm just going to go there, polymathic. Can you tell us a little bit about the interdimensionality of your work and why not stick to a lane? Like, what inspires you to continuously write more books in completely different avenues and directions, all dedicated to the one heart, which is work and having meaningful, loving work in your life, but all the different dimensionalities of it. Like, can you speak to that a little bit to us? Like, what is your inspiration in that space? Why is it so multidimensional? Yeah, please.
Well, I appreciate the question. It's, when I started doing this over 2 decades ago, I mean, I was in my 20s. I had come through a journey, my young life was focused on sports. So I grew up here in the US, in California, where I still live. I played baseball all growing up as a kid.
It's a huge part of your life, eh?
Yeah. And it's, it's something that a lot of American kids do in certain parts of the world. I know it's, there's a little bit down in Australia, New Zealand area, but not as much here. But so I was an athlete, and that's what I thought was going to kind of be my thing. Right. I mean, I grew up single mom. We didn't have a lot of money. I was really good at baseball. It's like, okay, this is my thing. And I go to college and play baseball there at Stanford University. Then I get drafted out of Stanford by the Kansas City Royals, one of our pro baseball teams here in the US. And I signed a pro contract. And you got to go into there's a bunch of levels of what's called the minor leagues before you make it to the major leagues. And I ended up getting injured when I was 23. And I had started baseball when I was 7. And I get hurt. And prior to even getting injured, I had also started, when I was in college, I had a couple of pretty serious bouts of depression. And at the time, in the mid 90s, I mean, we're talking so much more about mental health these days, thank goodness, for athletes and everybody. But in those days, there wasn't a lot of talk, although it wasn't even taboo. It just wasn't even talked about. It was just like out of the realm. And what happened, but you'll appreciate this, because what started to happen for me when I got depressed, I got scared because my dad had suffered from bipolar disorder for most of his life. So I was familiar with mental health issues and mental illness, but was scared. Oh no, I'm dealing with this depression. And I come from a family where this is pretty significant, but there was something sort of calling me, and I was, saw the doctor and saw the psychiatrist and went that route. But then I just sort of felt called in these directions that I couldn't quite articulate even at the time, because I was pretty young, but I would I met this man who was introduced to me by a friend, and he was kind of weird, but he was really interesting. And he was in his early 50s, and he started teaching me about meditation. He started sending me, books and cassette tapes. And my uncle, who was a therapist down in Texas, had been doing that even when I was younger. And I didn't even really understand what I was so drawn to.
Yeah.
But I was listening to cassette tapes of Marianne Williamson and Wayne Dyer, and I was wandering into bookstores and just finding myself in the sort of self-help spiritual section and going like, what's a 20-year-old baseball player with my hat on backwards doing in these places? But so what ended up happening was, over the span of those few years, and then ultimately culminating in the injury that ended my baseball career, which then threw me for a whole loop, because it's like, who the hell am I if I'm not an athlete, having started at 7 and retire at 25, and don't really, I'd gotten an education and done a few other things, but that was really what I thought was who I was, right? I was
identity crisis, man. Yeah.
So anyway, that's a long sort of background into what ultimately happened. I spent a couple of years working in the .com world in the late 90s here in the San Francisco, Silicon Valley area where I live. And then I got laid off, which was a blessing, because I wasn't really passionate about selling online advertising. I just had that job because I needed to pay the rent so I could live. But I was still in this sort of existential crisis of like, who the hell am I? What do I really want to do? What's my life about if it's not to be a Major League Baseball player? And what kept coming to me was, over the span of that previous 5 or 6 years, between about the age of 20 and 26, I had gone through a lot. The depression, a couple of heartbreaks, the end of my baseball career. And through that experience, had just come up against some real pain and some real sadness. But in the scheme of things, as a kid who'd always done well in school and done well in sports, and was now starting my career and in the, San Francisco.com, it looked good on the surface, but underneath I was really suffering. And what I realized was, everyone must be suffering at some level. We're just not talking about it. So that's really what started to draw me in the direction of like, wait a minute, I'm not the only one in pain here. And why are we all going around pretending like everything's cool when it's really not? I just wanted to go deeper. And that's what kind of started me on my own spiritual practice, which was already underway. But then I had this calling for, I think I'm supposed to talk about these things and teach these things. I don't know what, and I don't know why, and I don't know how. And I say that because, to your question of like, what's made it so multidimensional, it's always been for me about sharing the truth, and also whatever I'm going through, without being self-absorbed about it. I just assume other people are probably going through this. So if I can share a bit of my own experience, that may benefit them.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's quite profound, isn't it? Because oftentimes, and there's this thing about pain and suffering, which when we're going through it, and pardon guys, Inspired Evolution is meant to be about hope. We went straight into everything, but hey, we're being real, right?
Yes.
The interesting thing about pain and suffering is that it has this tendency for an inwards inflection. Do you know what I mean? It's like when we start going through something, it's like, oh, like even when people like, I lost my mentor a couple of years ago, and she completely turned herself into an island. Like, she literally detracted from the community, took herself away, didn't want anybody to see her in her pain and suffering, which totally respect her wishes. But just as an observation piece, it's like, and rest in peace, bless her soul, and she's no longer with us, but she is in spirit. But there's this really interesting like inflection that pain and suffering has, which is like, okay, return back inwards. It's like we close in, the flower sort of closes in on itself, but it's this real, just remarking on something in there, which is like, you did go in and you felt your pain, and but then there's this, surely I'm not alone in feeling this way, or even potentially I'm not alone in feeling this way, and allowing yourself to sort of crack open a little bit to say, hey, it's really messy and gooey and in here, thoughts. Totally. And then how that connects people to sort of being seen and witnessed in like the path that you've taken.
Well, it does. And what's interesting, I mean, I think about pain or difficulty in kind of an interesting way, in the sense that, look, I mean, I'm not waking up in the morning saying, oh, I really want today to be painful and awful and miserable. Not at all. However, walking around the planet now for 48 years myself, and I'm sure there's people listening who are much younger or much older than I am. It's like we experience things. My friend Robert Holden likes to say, by the time you get to be 30 years old, you usually have more than enough reasons to be miserable for the rest of your life. And then it becomes a choice. Like, how do I choose to live? Right.
Choice.
And ultimately, I mean, and look at what we've all gone through over the last 2 years, like lots of pain and suffering, whether it's personally or collectively around us. And then there's the ultimate choice of, how am I going to show up in the midst of this? How am I going to show up in the face of this? And for me, earlier in my life, what I started to realize was, oh yeah, this notion of dealing with difficulty and challenge is universal. We all have our own unique challenges that we face, but there's something kind of humbling and beautiful, even in the pain, that sort of connects us to like, oh, everybody experiences some level of this. And for me, it's always been a process. And one of the silver linings sometimes when things go wrong or are hard or are painful is it wakes us up to all the good stuff that we weren't necessarily paying attention to. So the very first book that I wrote came out back in 2007, which seems like 1,000 years ago now, is called Focus on the Good Stuff.
Yeah.
And it was really about my journey into, oh, how do I cultivate a practice of gratitude and appreciation for other people, for myself, for life? Because that doesn't come naturally to me. I wasn't raised in a family where we sat around and talked about what we were grateful for. There was a lot of whining and complaining. There was a lot of woe is me that was kind of infused on me. And I don't say that to throw my parents under the bus. They were both dealing with, they split up when I was 3, and they were both dealing with a set of challenges, my father's mental illness and my mother being a single mom, just trying to make her way through the world. But I realized, oh, this gratitude thing, this appreciation thing, I'm going to have to actually practice that and learn that and teach myself that. And then what I started to look out into the world, and I realized, oh, that doesn't seem like there's an abundance of that just flowing around.
It's not a baseline norm. Yeah.
And it's, however, it's really simple, but it's powerful.
Yep.
And so for me, it was like, okay, I want to learn. And one of the things is, circling back even to your original question, everything that I write about, everything that I speak about and teach about, if you will, it's always stuff that first and foremost, I either struggle with and or I want to learn more about. So there's a self-serving part of it. It's like, let me try to figure this out. And if I figure any of it out, not like so much in terms of expertise, but just like, oh, I think I've uncovered something about this.
Yeah.
I'm just someone who likes to share. If I see a movie that I really like, or I watch a TED Talk that I really like, or I'm binging a show, I'm going to be like, dude, you got to watch this. It's amazing. Now, you may think it's ridiculous, but I'm going to tell you about it, whether you want to hear about it or not.
Yeah. I love that. And there's a massive ode to, like, one of the people that I had on the podcast, Joe Vitale, he talks about when you get inspired, that's the best place to create from, because there's that moment where you go, and it's like, use that thing that helped you draw energy, brings energy in, animates you, that prana, whatever you want to look at it as, use it, harness it, And I feel like one of my other friends, actually one of the first guests we ever had on the podcast, Sam, he said, something's really good and really helpful when you want to share it. He's a massive introvert, like he's a beautiful introvert. He's just one of those sage individuals. And he's like, but there's those moments where it's like, I want to share that. And it's like, yeah, man, those, you're onto something with that. So let's dovetail from that and let the rubber hit the road, man. So from here, we're talking a little bit about pain and the suffering and the collective and opening ourselves up to that. There is this stat that is flying around. 80% of us are dissatisfied in our job, in the work that we do. Coupled with this other stat that 1 in 2 of us around the world now are anxious or depressed. I personally, I know for a fact that, potentially there is nobody out there that is drawing a correlation between the two. In my intuitive heart of hearts, it's the one correlation that I keep drawing and keep drawing and keep drawing. My humble perspective is, we discussed this earlier, it was the birth of the inspired evolution, rocking up to a job. I was doing 12 hours a day, but, for most people, it's 8 hours a day where, I just feel like it's an archaic conversation now. It's like I drink my green juice smoothie. I go to yoga. I do go to the gym. I've got my martial arts. I've got my meditation practice. I got all these things that I'm doing. I'm ticking all these boxes. I'm eating healthy and clean. But I spend 8 hours of my day where I absolutely hate what I do. Right. And it's like, but I'm healthy. It's like the boundaries have just completely dissolved in my humble opinion. It's like, you know what? You're spending the majority of your waking hours doing something you don't like, just emotional regulation wise. Like, that cannot be good for you, man. So Let's talk about that pain, that suffering, the 80% stat. Like, how does that ring true? I know you do a lot of talks, Google, TED, like, there's a lot of that you've afforded the world in this space. Does that feel like it's true for you? And do you think there's a disruption underway? Can we just riff on that and unpack it a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to that. What's interesting, just in terms of even my own journey with my work,
Mm,
I didn't set out when I first started doing this work, 21, almost 22 years ago, that I was going to go inside of organizations and speak to people there because, here I was, former athlete. I worked for two companies and they were relatively small, internet startup companies. They weren't like big corporations. So I didn't really even know what that sort of corporate world was
mm,
like. And I didn't love it when I was
mm,
doing the .com thing, but then I got laid off and it was sort of like, oh, and I actually started my business kind of by accident because I was hoping to get hired by someone or a small firm or someplace I could get mentored and sort of be an apprentice and learn some things. And
mm,
the economy was terrible at the time. So I just figured, all right, well, I'm going to have to start my own thing.
mm,
And again, the models that I had, the people that I looked to were the Wayne Dyers and Marianne Williamsons and Deepak Chopras of the world. And
mm,
although my background was a little different, I sort of felt like that's the direction that I want to go. And for a
mm,
number of years in my work, I was just writing things that were really calling to me. But what kept happening was these companies kept hiring me to come in and speak, which was kind of great on the one hand. But then on the other hand, I'm like, I'm not really a corporate guy. I actually don't really love the corporate world. I have some issues and some opinions and some judgments, and people seem
mm,
so. But then I started to see this opening where it was like, oh, I can go in there and talk about some things and share some ideas that you and I might talk about here on your podcast that are
mm,
very personal and very spiritual, but do it in the context of how do you actually bring more of yourself to the work that you do? How can it be more fulfilling? And maybe the truth is for a lot of people, some of those 80%, the most authentic thing to do would be quit your job and go do your own thing. And at the
mm,
same time, you and I both know not everybody's in the position to be able to do that.
mhm,
You
mhm,
can, and you have the courage or you have the means or the resources or the privilege or just the willingness or whatever, more power to you. But I think there's a way where it can be both. And I do think there's some fundamental things that are going on inside of the corporate world, if you will, that don't work and don't work
mm,
for anybody involved. And at the same time, I also think just the nature of like we're in the middle of this revolution right now that we don't even fully understand of how everybody works and what
mm,
people can do and the fact that everyone can do everything basically virtually.
mm.
I think what comes on the other side of this potentially could be a real renaissance, of people being more inspired and more engaged in their work. But the other thing that I'll say for what it's worth is you probably know this yourself, having started your own business, leaving, the corporate world. There's a lot of freedom and liberation, but it's also not that easy. It looks
Mm.
sexy, right? When you're stuck in the 9 to 5 job that you hate and
Come
you're
on,
like,
man! You
oh,
can't put that in the sales pitch. I got to turn this podcast off now.
but no, but but
It's
let's be
legit.
real
It's
about it.
legit. It's not like we see it starry eyed. It's like I'm going to
Yes.
disconnect, and it's just going to be, oh my god, all the freedom and space. And it's like, actually, you're your own boss now, and dude, you got some
Totally.
real things to look at. Like, yeah,
Well,
man.
and I remember someone saying to me in kind of a brutal way. He's like, but it was a mentor of mine early on. He goes, look, Mike, there's people in life that are wired to get a paycheck, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's people in life who are wired to go create something of their own. And he's like, and there are different skill sets and there's
Mhm.
different mindsets. And the reality is in different stages of your life, one might be more appealing than the other. So I say this all in, I actually look at work as a spiritual practice for all of us. And it's really about our intention. You could have the most sort of cookie cutter, boring on the surface kind of corporate job where you feel like you sell your soul to do it, but you could bring an enormous amount of yourself and passion and inspiration to it. Or you could have the most incredibly inspiring looking business that you started on your own and you grew and it's fantastic and it's a full expression of who you are. And you could be miserable because as someone who's done something that I absolutely love for all these years, there are times during this that I've absolutely loved every minute of what I'm doing. And there's other times where it's been awful. And the only difference is me and how I'm relating to it or what's going on. And so I say that because it comes back to like at the core of my work, it's really about like we're at choice. We're the source, if you will, in our human experience of how it is for us. And I've seen people inside of an organization, say like Google, that's like this cool, fun place to work that love being there because it's fantastic or hate it. And it's not about the place, it's about them.
Mm,
So that's where it really comes to with us. And I think so often I think what we do is blame the circumstances as opposed to really bring ourselves to it and say, okay, if something's not working, what do I need to shift?
Mm-hmm. I love that, and I can hear the echoes of nothing changes unless we do, really in that, brother. So
Yeah.
let's really just go there for a moment, because the difference is me is something that
Yes.
you just said then. And it's, I think on a surface level, everybody kind of gets that. It's like, it's like a mindset conversation.
Yep.
It's basically what it is.
Yeah.
But I know from having followed your work that it's way deeper than that. It's like, it's
Yeah.
almost that when the student is ready, only
Yes.
then does the teacher appear. So
Well,
yeah,
and
please.
I have two stories related to that are both about me actually writing books, for what it's worth. So people listening, if
Mhm.
you're interested in writing books, great, but it's not about that. But when I tried to get my first book published years ago,
Mm.
it was about a 6-year process, 5-6 year process. I got rejected by 25 publishers. I was really, really, even early on, I was like, I got to write a book. I got to write, and I'm pretty achievement oriented, for better or worse. So
Yep.
I focus on that. I go through all the steps. I do all the things you're supposed to do, but there's not enough interest, and they keep saying no. And
Mm.
my ego's getting bruised, and I'm learning from it, but pretending like I don't care when I really do care, and feeling
Mm.
discouraged, and the whole thing, right? And finally, I was on my second literary agent, and she was sending it out one at a time, and it kept getting rejected and rejected. And she calls me and says, Mike, listen, you're a nice guy, and I know you're really passionate about this appreciation stuff, but I don't think it's going to happen. And I had just had a baby. Our now 16-year-old daughter, you can relate to this,
Whoa.
right?
Yeah.
Our 16-year-old Samantha was like a couple weeks old when
Yo.
I had that conversation with Linda, my old agent. And I said to her, she told me on a Friday, and I was really disturbed and disgusted and disappointed and frustrated. And I was like, and I talked to my wife, and I literally couldn't sleep over the weekend. I was just all churned up about it. And I woke up, I think Sunday morning, and I remember saying to Michelle, my wife, screw it. I'm not waiting for permission anymore. I don't care if Linda thinks this is a good idea. I don't care if any publisher, I'm publishing this damn book because it needs to come out of me. It's now become uncomfortable. I have to write this thing. And I'm someone who does not like to write, even all these years later. It's not my favorite thing. I'm an extrovert. I like talking to people. I don't like sitting in a room by myself writing. I was always like, every paper I wrote in school, I did at the absolute last minute. So everyone listening, do not train your children to be this way in school and in life, but this was how I was. So I say that because
Yeah.
I called Linda on Monday, and I said, listen, I hear you, I understand, but I'm not waiting anymore. I'm going to write this book. I'll self-publish it. I'm done waiting for
6 years
permission. I
in.
need,
Yeah.
yeah. And she's like, okay, hold on a second. She goes, look, before you do that, I know, let me send it. I have 3 more on my list that I didn't get to, but I'm going to send it all to all 3 of them this week, and we'll see what happens. A couple days later, she calls me back and she says, Mike, all 3 publishers are interested. This was the same proposal that kept getting rejected. And the only thing I can see now, looking back at that experience, this was, early 2006. I wrote that book.
With
It came out in
hindsight.
2007.
Yeah.
I wasn't ready until that moment. Something shifted in me. And I don't know if it was having the baby or just getting pissed off or whatever the heck it was,
Uh-huh.
but then I was ready to actually what it was going to take to write the thing and put the thing out into the world. And prior to that, even though I thought I was ready, I can see now with enough perspective, oh, I wasn't. So it was that internal shift. And again, it wasn't about the way she pitched it or the way that it was written. It was the exact same thing. And I bet every single person listening to this right now has had an experience, if not multiple experiences, of that happening in their life, either in big ways or small ways, when something finally clicks. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm ready now, or okay, let's do it. And then the universe has a way of reorganizing itself right around us in a very short amount of time. And it's not about hard work. It's not even about determination. It's literally about something shifting.
It's really, thank you so much for sharing that, because it does get a little trippy dippy when you start tuning into that. One of my mentors, Vishen Lakhiani, CEO of Mind Valley, he mentioned this. He'd written a book called The Code of the Extraordinary Mind. Great book. I love it. I help actually teach people some of the practices in there. But he went, like, he'd written it for years and then randomly went away on a trip to South America, worked with some plant medicines, came back. And on the flight back, there was this drop in for him, which was like, hey, check your book. And he checked the standing of his book on Amazon, and all of a sudden it was on #1, and it stayed on #1 as a self-improvement book again and again. And we're talking for like a long, like more than weeks, like ages, right? Months, maybe even a year, I think. And it was just like, for him, it was like, it's the same book. It's been in the marketplace for ages. Like what? Like why
Right.
all of a sudden? Like normally you launch a book and it launches onto #1,
Right.
and then
Right.
it's sort of, and it's just been like, like what? Like it's interesting. It's interesting. It's intriguing. It's intriguing.
It is.
Yeah.
And there's so many factors that go into things like that, whether we're talking about books or products or ideas. I mean, just think of the internet, right?
Mm.
I mean, all of us are on the internet to whatever degree we are. We're on social media. You know, you have a podcast, you do your work, I do, but whatever you do in life, I mean, all of us are publishing something for the most part. I mean, it's much more the exception than the rule these days for people that like, yeah, I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, I don't do any of that. And that's fine. If you do, if you don't, more power to you. I mean, look, there's a lot of potential negativity in all of
Pitfalls.
that as well, pitfalls for sure. But what's amazing to me is I'm always fascinated by ideas that go viral. Like, how does that happen? Right? Like something, or, you know, you have a podcast, you look at all of a sudden one episode, just, whoa, a whole bunch of people listen to that one. It's like, okay, sometimes it might be it was so-and-so was on it or this thing happened, but most often it's like, I don't really know what happened there. You know, it's like you do your thing, and then something pops. And it's always this interesting thing for me just to look at how that happens more as a phenomenon of energy as opposed to some practical strategic thing, you know, that we try to make happen, if you will. Because I do think it comes down, again, the second story that I have that's also sort of book related, a couple years later. So I wrote 2 books sort of back to back, my first 2. And we had 2 babies. I wrote 2 books and we had 2 babies in the span of about 3.5 years. So, you know, I mean, I know you have a new baby yourself, and it's a lot, right? It's like a lot, and it's I mean, it's amazing and it's intense. It's just,
it is intense, is the right word.
It's intense. It's just a lot. Like my wife and I watched this movie years ago, and it's about some guy who was wanting to have kids, and he goes to the park, and the kids are all playing, and he's talking to some dad who's got 3 kids, and he's like, "What's it like being a dad?" And the guy was like, "You want me to tell you the truth?" And he said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, it's awful, awful, awful. Then it's amazing. Then it's awful, awful. Then it's amazing. Then it's awful, awful." And we were like peeing in our pants laughing, because it was like, oh my God, that's exactly what it feels like, especially in the baby toddler years when you're still like, what the hell is going on? Is this how it's supposed to feel? Because this is not what I expected.
Literally my life right now. That's what you're describing.
Right, so 2 babies, 2 books in the span of 3.5 years. And oh, by the way, this also happened. Our first baby was born in 2006. The first book came out in 2007. The second baby was born in 2008. The second book came out in 2009. And then the economy imploded, which happened right after we bought our first house. And right as I thought, oh, my business is really starting to go. I'm doing this. Here we go. And then boom, right? So all of that happened. And I remember what I basically said to my wife was like, okay, look, I know one thing I'm not going to do for a while. I'm not going to write another book, because writing a book for me, while I'm grateful to have written them, is hard work. There's a lot involved. It's like a whole other business on top of my regular business. And so things sort of stabilized. The girls got a little bit older. The economy got a little bit better. And then I felt like I was ready to write my 3rd book, but I was really scared, because I was like, those first 2 experiences, while I'm proud of the books, grateful that I did it, they were really hard, and I did not go about them in the most elegant way. So when I was in the middle of writing my 3rd book, which you referenced just a minute ago, it's called Nothing Changes Until You Do. I had this really basic but profound realization, because I was working with this amazing woman named Melanie, who's since been my writing partner and editor, and for the last 3 books that I've done. And I love working with her because it's much more collaborative, and we get to talk and share ideas, and it's like I'm having a conversation with a friend, which just works so much better for me and my style. But I remember saying to her at one point, oh my gosh, Mel, I just realized, like, writing a book's actually not that hard. You know what's hard? Dealing with myself is the hard part. That's why I haven't done it. That's why I was so unhappy the last 2 times when I did this, because I was in this fight with myself the whole time. Like, this is stupid. You're an idiot. Stop talking to yourself like that. You're writing about positivity. And then I'm like a crazy person having this conversation, right? And it's like, oh, that's the part that's hard. It's not the actual doing of the thing. And then I was like, parenting and marriage and all these things that, can be complex and have some challenge to them. But it's like, no. It's me that brings the challenge. The thing itself is actually just the thing, whatever the heck it is. I get to bring the challenge or the joy. I get to bring the intensity or the passion or the whatever. And it's like, oh, well, then that changes the game quite significantly, because then
Completely.
if I want to write 20 books, I get to write 20 books. If I want to write none, I get to write none. I get to choose. But then what's the experience like? It's up to me.
It's wow, it's almost like I'm a guitar being strummed by you right now. My intention this year literally has been ease. And it's been ease for that exact reason, that realization that, yeah, the choice lies with me in terms of,
Yeah,
and oh man, like, I often find when I set an intention, it's almost like the shadow of it shows up more than
sure.
the light of it. And it's
Of
like the
course.
number of places where I go unconsciously out of my way to make things less easy
Right.
than the easiest path, And it's like, yeah.
Well, we don't, and one thing about our culture, and again, it's a little different where you live, I believe, than where I live to some degree. I've spent just a little bit of time in Australia, but I know here in America, and I think this is true in lots of places in the world, we don't value ease. In
Mm.
fact, we look down upon it. It's like it doesn't mean anything if you didn't work for it. You gotta
Oh, too
work
easy.
hard, you gotta suffer, right? It's, yeah, this notion of, and I have to
Yeah.
manage that within myself. It's like,
Mm.
oh yeah, this story of like, I can do it, I got grit, I'm a hard worker, I'll make it happen. And that's the sort of hero story of everything, is the
Mm.
overcoming the obstacle. And the reality is there are obstacles to overcome, there are challenges we have to work through always.
Mhm.
However, if we have an intention like yours this year, which is great, of ease, my intention this year, by the way, is freedom.
Mm.
And for me, baked into freedom is some ease and some like, oh, certain things don't have to be so hard, or
Mm.
the stuff that I find challenging. What if there was more freedom around it? What if there was more spaciousness around those
Mm.
things? What if instead of, that little nasty voice in my head saying, you're an idiot, you should have figured this out by now. It's just it's just more like, oh, what if I had freedom around that thing
Yeah.
that isn't my favorite thing to do, or I'm not that great at, that I could find someone to do,
Mm.
or I could figure out, or maybe there's a new, simpler way to do it, or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
then, if the notion, even to what you were talking about, what if instead of this notion of, if it's easy, it doesn't count?
Yeah.
What if like it counted more if it was easy?
That's really where I'm at the moment as well, similar
Yeah,
to you, is like giving myself exercising it as a practice. And yeah,
yeah,
it's been a whole body of work. And yeah, I love the way you describe that in terms of your experiences as well, that it's just, as you shift, the opportunity of like what you bring to the experience shifts, and then somehow metaphysically, even the experience may shift as well. Don't get too attached to it, but it's just this
totally.
real, like, it's really, really, really profound. One of the things that we can sort of pull out as a thread in there is um, the permission piece. Yeah, because
Mm,
even you setting the intention of freedom and me setting the intention of ease, there's going to be someone in there giving the other permission for
yeah,
themselves to sort of go to these places. And I'm almost sort of hearkening back into that whole self conversation,
yeah,
because that takes a certain amount of permission. Like I know going into the workforce, it's, you know, sort of, sorry, I'll just sort of take conversation for a sec, which is, one of the moments. So when I graduated university, and I say this with every grain of humility, the reason I got this award was so that I could inspire others. Is basically when they asked, why would you get this award? It was like so that I would inspire others. So I'll share that in this vein, which is I graduated not just top of like engineering, not just top of structural engineering, top of like the entire year of cohort that year, right? And they gave me this
mm,
award.
nice.
And the last question they asked was, was about leadership. And they said, what do you think is the current shift in leadership and what's happening in that space? And it was one of those moments where like, like similar to you, hat backwards, but totally into self-improvement, that was kind of my vibe. And I was just like, wow, this is like a total, like, I didn't prep for a question like this. It was a total
Right,
Jesus take the wheel moment, right?
right.
And what tumbled out of my mouth was, I think there is a way, like an old form of leadership that is archaic and it's dying, and it's the way of the manager.
Yeah,
Because I think what managers do is like you manage and manage. It was great for a while, but like when I think about a bird in a cage, if I'm managing it, yeah, like I'm actually clipping its wings to be just perfect, so I can sit there in the cage and be like sing its song and like, yep, well managed. But it's like, what about all the places that bird could have flown? And it's like,
right.
No, I want the song. So I've managed the bird to generate song. Yeah. So you don't get to see flight and song. You just see song, as opposed to potentially what I see the new version of leadership being is, how do I actually get a couple of fans, rig them up and actually, hey, sing, but also fly? Like, can I help you out here? And actually see how far it could fly, even though I have no agenda for flight in my own requirements.
Yes.
Because out of care and love for just fostering, growth in another, there's like,
Yes.
hey, fly and sing,
Yeah.
I need the song, but please do fly as well. And I think when I shared that with them, there was kind of like, it was, I don't want to say a mic drop moment, but it was in that moment that I sort of felt like, oh, that was the response that, I think I sort of shifted some perspectives, and I think I'm going to go home with this award, touch wood. And it was really humbling to receive that. And again, I just share that because the reason they said, why should we give this award to you, is like, because I wouldn't really use it for me. Like, I struggled with depression and transformed. And if I could take home this award, then it would be like an opportunity to inspire others, which inspired evolution. So I share it in that vein, but to come back to sort of go, hey, like, that permission piece that we're looking for, it's like permission to be expressively, completely ourselves, to be able to show up into these spaces. Do you think there is a shift underway? Because we're having this conversation, you and I, you've been having it for multiple decades now. Do you think there is a shift within the corporate space enabling people to be even more expressively themselves?
Yes and no. I think it depends on where you are. And I think it depends on, the type of work you do, the organization that you're in, and also you. I'll give you an example of this. So someone that I know who works for a big technology company, who's, about 15 years younger than me. And she and I have been connecting recently, and I've been doing some mentoring with her. And she's been wanting to leave her organization to go out on her own, right? And feeling that sense, again, I feel like this caged bird, and and liking the people that she works with and some of the work that she does, but in general feeling, okay. So what ended up happening though, she happens to actually host a podcast as part of and sort of in conjunction with the work that she does. And then she ended up interviewing the CEO of their company on her podcast. And after the interview, he said, "You are so good at this. You should be doing this full time. Create a position for yourself inside the company where this is what you get to do." And she was like, "Are you kidding?" And so that's what happened essentially, was like, so what she did was she didn't have to leave her job because she was scared in a practical sense of like, I've never run my own business. I don't know how I would make money to pay the rent initially. And that's a little scary and all that. And I don't hate where I work. I actually like some of the people. It just feels like it's not an expression for me. But now I get to be here for another few years doing this, having a podcast, creating some content internally to inspire people internally. That's what I ultimately want to do. So now look, not everybody's going to be able to create that kind of situation, but I hear stories like that. And I do work with some really progressive companies, both big and small, where those types of things are happening. And look, right now, workers have a ton of leverage and power because the job market is so good. So this whole great resignation thing, people are leaving, and some of it's just there's opportunities. Some of it's because people can work remotely in different parts of the world and do lots of different things. Some of it's because people have been stuck at home for the last couple of years and haven't been able to go anywhere. They're just sick of what they're doing. So I say all of that back to what you and I were talking about earlier. Look, if you're someone who's left your job and has started your own thing, fantastic. More power to you. If you're someone who's in a job that you don't love, okay, you have a couple of options. You can either just be miserable in that situation and complain about it. You can try to create a better situation internally where you are, or go somewhere else inside of a different organization, maybe where it'll be better, or you can take the leap and step out. The reality is all of those scenarios have potential pros and cons to them. Again, it comes back to you. And I actually believe, having done this work in the corporate world for the last 20 plus years, I have seen a big shift, and there's much more openness to these types of conversations that you and I are having than there was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of shadow and a lot of funky stuff going on too that you have to be aware of. So it's about sort of navigating through it. But I've seen, and back to this notion of leadership and permission, so many times what I've seen is people just give themselves permission to bring more of themselves to work. And what they find is they either can transform the situation that they have into one that's more conducive to them, or they leave, but do it in a really intentional way that sets them up for much more likely to succeed in whatever they're going to go do next.
how do we bring more of ourselves to our organizations? When you say that, it's very inspiring. It's very inspiring to feel into that. And
Yeah.
let's say I've given myself permission to sort of, okay, I'm going to do that. What does it actually look like in the execution thereof?
Well, there's two parts to it, because the
Mm.
reality is nothing happens in a vacuum, right?
Mm.
So where you work, the people you work with, the way the leader and leaders that you work with operate is going to set some of the context and the culture. So there are some places it's easier to do that than others. I mean, the other reality, I remember when my book, Bring Your Whole Self to Work, came out back in 2018, I'm traveling around here in the US and around the world. And I had people, and I appreciated this very earnestly, people would come up to me and, hey, Mike, easy for you to say, bring your whole self to work. You're white, you're straight, you're male, you have all of these privileges.
Mm.
And what was interesting is I was not unfamiliar with that conversation at a bunch of levels, just given where I grew up and how I grew up and some of the things that I'd been studying. But I found it interesting because at that time, it took me to a deeper level of understanding privilege in a way that I didn't quite understand it back then.
Mm.
And I realized, oh yeah, all of us have different privileges based on all kinds of stuff, not just our race and our gender and our orientation, but we take most of the privileges we have for granted. So we're not all starting at the same place. Again, the CEO of the company may have a bunch of pressure on him or her, but they're going to have a certain amount of ability to say and do certain things, as would a senior leader, different than someone who just started last week or is in the very early stages of their career. If you happen to be in the majority in the organization where you are in terms of your identity, that's probably going to have you feel a little bit safer than if you're not, a whole bunch of other factors. So I say all of that because the truth of it is, bringing our whole selves to work is about being authentic. And ultimately, it's about being vulnerable, which for all of us as human beings, regardless of however much privilege or confidence we might have, is a risky proposition, because there's something that we can potentially lose when we do that. It's one of the reasons why it's easier, or seems easier in most situations, especially professionally, to be full of it, to play the role we think we're supposed to play. But instead of owning the fact that we do that, we blame it on the environment and we say it's their fault. What do you want from me? But the truth is, I have seen people absolutely bring all of themselves, again, to the most intense corporate job possible. And I've also seen people do creative things outside of the box where they're not being authentic at all. So it really is about, am I willing to, and authenticity is an in the moment phenomenon. I can be just as full of shit as anybody else in any moment if I'm not paying attention, if I'm not present. And I know how to play the game like everybody else does. But if I'm present and I'm really bringing myself fully, like to this conversation, that's a moment by moment choice that I make, just like all of us, all the time. My wife and I have been together for a couple of decades. I love her. I can fully be myself with her, but I have to intentionally bring myself to my marriage every day and every time I interact with her, because, right, especially given how well we know each other, I can just as easily not pay attention or be on my phone or like take her for granted.
Take it for granted.
Like, wait a second, this is the most important person in my life. And like, that's a practice for me, just like it is for her, if we choose to engage that way.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're talking about presence, and I feel like there is potentially more presence that organizations and leaders within organizations are affording employees. I do want to go there, and I kind of know that the answer will be multifold to this, but I really want to ask, because it'd be rude not to, especially in this space. I don't know how to call it, what I want to call it, but I'm going to go with corporate band-aiding. There is this, we're setting up wellness programs, we're setting up mindfulness programs, we're setting up yoga offerings, we're setting up things within organizations, which is really beautiful, and it's inspiring to sort of go, man, like, they give a shit. Like, this is kind of cool. There's a human coming to work and they want to try and honor the human. I love this. And but then sometimes it's, on the surface level, it feels amazing. But then when you start to unpack it, it's like, yeah, it's about employee retention and just keeping them engaged, and it's like the metrics, and it's like, oh man, the intention, you got me at the intention. Can we? What are your thoughts on some of that stuff?
I think you're spot on. I mean, I think there's a lot of performative stuff that does happen, whether it's around well-being, mindfulness, whether it's around diversity and inclusion, whether it's around, activism and other things. And some of it, look, I think trying to talk the talk and say the right thing or set up the programs is better than not doing it at all. And then I think it comes like, I'll give you an example. So a lot of how I actually started in coming into the business world, about 15, 20 years ago, companies were starting to put together these recognition programs, right? And it was really important because that was for employee retention, that was for motivation, that was, we can get people excited, we recognize them, maybe they'll work harder, maybe they'll produce more results. But then they were doing these employee surveys and it was coming back, people were miserable, they weren't feeling valued, they were leaving because culture sucked or whatever the thing was. And I didn't know about this. I wasn't anything that I'd studied, but I was studying and writing a lot about gratitude and appreciation. And I started to see, there's a difference between recognition, which is about performance, and appreciation, which is about people. So recognition is about telling people you did a good job, you produced a good result, which we all like. If you work hard on something and nobody says anything about it, even at home, it's like if you clean the kitchen and your spouse doesn't say, wow, it looks amazing, you don't need that necessarily, but it's more motivating to want to do it again, right? If you work really hard on something or you produce something, you write something, you create something, and it goes out into the world and nobody says anything about it, it feels good to be recognized when we produce some result, right?
Absolutely.
However, recognition is conditional. You have to produce some result. You have to do it. It has to be good versus not good. There's, factors. And as a former athlete, like sometimes you win the game, sometimes you lose the game. Like you don't get a trophy when you lose the game, right? Appreciation, on the other hand, though, is much more expansive. It's really about recognizing people's value. It's about caring about people. And so to your question, when I work with organizations, they could have all of the recognition programs and mindfulness programs and wellness programs and diversity and inclusion initiatives and all the things that on paper look fantastic. And you go, wow, they got it. They're doing it. They know. But if people aren't really living it and embodying it and actually caring about each other, right? There's a lot of conversation over the last couple of years, which is long overdue, about mental health at work. However, people are still really burned out and not mentally well right now because of a lot of factors. So it's like talking about it is better than not talking about it, but actually doing something is harder. Same thing with diversity, right? We can talk about, we got to do a better job with diversity at the senior level within the company. Understanding that and seeing that is great, and having initiatives is great, but actually creating environments where people from all different walks of life and backgrounds and who look different, come from different places, have the same opportunity, that's a lot harder to do. And so again, there are some companies that are really getting it right, and most are really struggling trying to figure it out. And a lot of it right now, because the job market is what it is, they're just scrambling and trying to keep talent as much as they can. And that's what I said before, for better or worse, right now, employees have a lot of leverage and a lot of power. Now that will eventually change. It goes in cycles, right? Things will change. And if the economy comes down and then all of a sudden companies aren't hiring as abundantly, or they start laying people off, that's one thing I say, and I don't mean to be cynical about this, but it's one thing to have a conversation about, I'm out of here, I don't like this anymore, when things are really abundant. When things go in the other direction, there sometimes can be not necessarily more meaning and fulfillment, but sometimes people have a little more gratitude for, hey, you know what, this ain't my dream job, but I'm glad I got a job.
Can you help us anchor the appreciation prayer and just helping people recognize what it looks like? So, yeah, Daddy loves Samantha. Can you tell us about that? And why? And then
a couple things I would say about it is, so appreciation's on multiple levels, right? There's gratitude. Let's start with gratitude. Gratitude is just about, like, if you take a moment right now, everybody listening, if you can, if you're driving, obviously don't do this, but you can close your eyes or leave them open, but just ask yourself the question, what am I grateful for in this moment? And just see what arises. It could be a person, it could be a feeling, it could be an experience, it could just be, I'm grateful to be here in this moment, listening to this conversation. I'm grateful the technology exists to do this. I'm grateful for someone that I love, for my health and well-being, for my, the work that I do, whatever it is. So gratitude is kind of more of a universal thinking about the world, our life, and just counting our blessings. What can I be grateful for? And there's always stuff to be grateful for, right? When we think about acknowledging another human being, that's when we express our gratitude for someone that we love or care about. It may not be someone that we know very well, but It could be in more of a reactionary form of a thank you, like a recognition. Thank you for doing that, right? They did something that it could just simply be, if you just take a moment right now to bring someone into your mind who you really love and care about, a friend, a family member, a significant other, a child, and just think about, what do I really love and appreciate and value about this person? And feeling that is one thing that's really powerful. If we then are willing to authentically express that to them, that becomes this beautiful gift that we can give that doesn't cost anything. It doesn't take much time. And oh, by the way, when we give it away, you know what happens? We get to keep a piece of it, not selfishly, but that's just the way appreciation works. So just like, right, me just appreciating like your passion and how much you love what you do and how appreciated I feel just having this conversation with you, by expressing it to another, it's one of these weird abundant gifts that it's like you get the gift, but I get to keep a piece of the gift, and it's this virtuous cycle. And one thing I'll say about this, it's so simple, but interpersonally, what I see us struggle with, some of this is cultural and it varies different parts of the world, but most of us aren't very good at receiving appreciation from other human beings.
Whoa, that's a huge topic,
right? And some of it is like, again, social norm and cultural norm. And our mother told us, don't be arrogant, or you should just deflect, or you should say, oh, no, it wasn't me, or no, all this stuff.
You're looking at a master deflector here.
Yeah. But part of it, here's the way to think about it. Imagine I came, now I know we live, halfway around the world from each other, but imagine I was at your house and it was your birthday and I brought you a birthday present. I said, hey, happy birthday. And you went, what is the matter with you? I don't deserve this present. And you threw it on the floor, right? First of all, that's rude. Second of all, you'd ruin the gift. And third of all, guess what? I'm not giving you any more gifts, man. Right? That's what we do when we deflect or discount. But even worse is not necessarily even worse, but something else we do is that we sometimes reflexively just reciprocate, and we may mean it, but we do it so quickly and so almost knee-jerk, like inauthentically. Yeah. Oh, you too, you're great too. That would be like you running into the other room and coming out with a present for me and saying, happy birthday to you too, Mike. And be like, it's not my birthday. That's thoughtful, but weird. Like, you don't need to give me. So what we can practice is, when someone says something to us, even just simple of like, you have a nice smile, or that's a nice shirt, or something deeper, like, I really value the way you think. I appreciate the way you love me, and whatever it is. Even if we don't agree with them, because sometimes that little gremlin-y voice in our head is going to have a disagreement with, It's not important, by the way. My opinion of your appreciation of me is actually not that interesting to you, and it's not that helpful for me. So what we can learn to do is receive the appreciation as the gift that it is, because what that does is allows us to take it in. But by the way, back to the present analogy, how awesome is it when you give someone a present and they really appreciate it? They get the gift, but you get to feel really good because I gave them an awesome gift. So both people in that scenario win, right?
Yeah.
And then the third, and I think most important level of appreciation, and the hardest, is appreciating ourselves. Really appreciating ourselves, valuing ourselves. And it's so hard. I just posted this great quote today from Brene Brown, which I love, and I've posted it before, but she has this great saying where she says, talk to yourself as if you're talking to someone that you love. And it's like that conversation that we have with ourselves about ourselves all day long is one of the most important conversations that we have. And we're often either unconscious about it or incredibly negative and critical in a way we would never be to another human being, and not expect them to actually love and care about us, right? If we talk to another person the way we talk to ourselves sometimes, they wouldn't be friends with us. They'd be like, hey, you know what? This is a toxic relationship. I do not want to interact with you. So it's really a training on how to learn how to talk to ourselves and think about ourselves and relate to ourselves. And we don't get a ton of training in this regard, right?
Barely get any.
Or modeling. And something that I was taught early on, a mentor of mine said something to me right before Samantha was born, our 16-year-old, who's our older daughter. He said to me, Mike, the most important job you have when your daughter's born is to teach her how to love herself. And I said, okay, how do I do that? He said, you love yourself and you let her see that. That's how you teach her how to love herself. And look, it's challenging for sure for a lot of us. And as I've, she's now 16 years old and I watch, but one of the things that I did when both of our girls were young, this was a practice that I started that I loved. And I still try to sneak it in. And mostly I get eye rolls at this age, but I would say to the girls when they were really little, toddler age, and then I'd say, how much does daddy love you? And they would do this and they would put their hands that way and like this much. Or they'd say, what my younger one, Rosie, would say, to the moon and back. Or then she got into this thing, as high as God can count. I don't know where she even came up with that. She would say things like this, but how much does daddy love you? And it was yes. And then then there was a follow-up question. And how come daddy loves you so much? And what I had trained the girls to say was, because I'm me. And I said, that's right. Just because you're you. And when I started doing it, at first, I mean, it would almost move me to tears. And I don't mean to sound sort of hyperbolic about it, but it was because what I realized, I was actually saying it to them, but I was saying it to me and to that little boy in me that somehow or another just learned as a kid that I was loved if I was cute. I was loved if I hit a home run in the baseball game. I was loved if I got a good grade on my whatever that was that I had to
conditional
perform. That I had to perform for my love. And I was a kid who performed pretty well. So I did get a lot of attention, but I turned that into, that's how you get love. And what I was trying to do with my girls, and also remind myself as a father, and I'm really having to remember it these days as they're teenagers too, that I love them regardless of their behavior or performance. My love is unconditional. Now I may have feedback. There may be some times we have to have some hard conversations, as we have at the ages that they are, for sure. But I love them no matter what, not because of how they look or what they do, but because they're them. And I think ultimately, when we really come down to it, whether we're talking about a business relationship or a personal relationship or our relationship with ourselves, if we can get into that space of really learning how to appreciate ourselves, the people around us, and life, there's no area of life or work that doesn't impact in a positive way.
I love that. I just want to breathe around that a little more. Thank you so much for sharing that, Mike.
Yeah.
Mike, I have to ask, is there a vision that you're harboring? What is the future of work potentially, or the future of humanity in our relationship with work? I think you get what I'm trying to elicit in my question. What does it feel like? What does it look like for you? What's the desired state potentially? If you could weave a prayer for humanity in the workplace, so what would it look like for us?
It's funny you ask that, because I think I've been in that conversation for the last couple of years, pre-COVID even, but especially as we've gone through the pandemic, because so much change and disruption and disconnection and uncertainty and all of this. And the most recent book that I wrote is called We're All in This Together.
Yeah.
And it came out right as the pandemic started, which was kind of weird because so many people were literally using that phrase. And I didn't write it with the pandemic in mind, but I had this really strong intuitive hit that I had to write a book, and it had to come out in 2020, and it had to be called We're All in This Together. And I had never had a download quite like that. And I didn't even want to write another book, as I talked about earlier. It's not my favorite thing to do. But I do think that there's something in that, and I don't mean to sound corny about it, but just this sense of togetherness, this sense of, both being able to appreciate the difference, but also see the common humanity. And I see glimpses of it. And I do think, through the pandemic, what I've been saying is, as people started asking me, are we really all in this together? It seems like we're more disconnected and separated than ever. It's more like we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. But I really feel like there's this sense, whether it's in big company, small company, start your own business, do your own thing, I do feel like there's this beauty of interconnectedness that we have and that we have access to. And I think there's a whole other level that we can go into it with more vulnerability, more heart, more compassion. And that's my prayer and my hope for not just the working world, but for the world as a whole.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I can really feel that it has a lot to do with our interpersonal relationships and the way we get to show up in it all, which I think is much more, if I can just speak from my heart, is much more mature than the sort of approach that I've afforded the vision, because I appreciate that one of my perspectives is I'm just going to go ahead and call it out, is it's quite juvenile. I feel like my perspective is that it would be beautiful if everybody could just do the work that they love.
Yes.
And, it's a big prayer that I'm carrying. And I trust that, there is some of us need to carry that prayer and that frequency. That's the intention behind the Inspired Evolution. Do more of what you love and make that your way of life and live a life that actually is an expression of your authentic love and self. And it's
Yes.
massively what I stand behind, and it's everything. And it is the Inspired Evolution, right? But one of the parts that, and the reason I'm calling it out as somewhat juvenile is, some part of me does beg the question is then who comes to pick up the bin in the street,
Right.
at the street, who potentially is being exploited, pardon me, somewhere else, to build the soldering ship that then puts this PC together for,
Right.
each PC is put together for like $50, but I spend $2,000 on it.
Right.
And so with that awareness of like all the stuff that like, from a, and I love again that hearkening to the maturity of your response, which is there will be the work, but it's the interpersonal relationships in terms of how we show up, which actually makes all the difference. Like when you start looking at some of the studies that people put out, it's if you have a friend, a couple of things there. If you have a friend at work or someone that you associate as a best friend, like
Yep.
your relationship with your work is completely different. Your job satisfaction charts are through the roof. And the
Totally.
other thing is people don't apparently quit jobs, they quit managers, which
Yep.
I thought was actually really profound. When I heard that, I was like, oh my God, it's just, and back to, ties into your point. It's the shadow of the fact that it's our interpersonal relationships.
It's the humans. I mean, it always is. When I talk to some of my buddies that I played ball with growing up and in
Mm.
college, whenever we get together and we sort of reminisce, what do we miss? We don't miss the game. We miss the guys. We miss being on the
Mm.
bus. We miss, and in that vein, as you were just talking, something popped into my head because I do think at the end of the day, it's like, look, we're human beings underneath it all, whatever
Mhm.
roles we play, whatever we do. And one of my favorite, when I was growing up, I was a really sensitive kid. I was a really emotional kid. I was raised by my single mom and my older sister were big influences on me, but I was scared of a lot of the other guys because I wasn't tough and strong. And if there was a fight, I was running the other way. And some guys who had brothers would like wrestle with each other and it would always kind of freak me out. But I'm around these guys all the time because I was an athlete and I was a pretty good
Mm.
athlete. But my favorite day of the season in this weird kind of way was always the last day. Because usually on the last day of the season, unless you win the championship, you lose and the season ends in a very sad way, right? You lose and then it's over. And it's sad because the season ends, but it's usually sad because, oh, we didn't win the championship. And I was on some championship teams, so I had that experience of the excitement of you win the whole thing and there's nowhere else to go. But what also would often happen on that last day when you'd lose the game to end the season is not all the guys, but a number would cry.
Mm.
And whether I was, 10 years old playing Little League or I was in college or I was even playing professionally, there would be tears. And the weird thing was, I was raised definitely of the era of boys don't cry, and we're still doing that to our
It's a
boys.
macho
Macho,
context too in
right?
sport, bro. Yeah.
Yeah. But to see these guys, like the toughest guy on the team, the one I was scared of, who I didn't think had any real emotion in there, put his glove over his face and see the tears running down his face, there was always a part of me that felt more connected to them, to everyone. Wow. And be less crazy myself. Like, oh, it's okay. We're all human.
Mhm.
And I say that because the moments for me, like I'll be in these like high level executive team meetings and I'm working with and there's someone says something and someone shares something and someone talks about their kid or their family or their mom who's sick or whatever. And it's this human moment and there's some tears. And all of a sudden we look around and realize we're just a bunch of human beings trying to figure out how to be human, whether we're working in a big corporation or a small company, whether we're working for ourselves, whether we're 25 or 75 or whatever the hell it is. It's like, I think there's something to that. And I've always been drawn to that. I've always been drawn to that realness and that common humanity. And to me, it doesn't matter where I go in the world or what I'm doing, or whether we're on Zoom or we're sitting in a small room or we're in a room with thousands of people. It's always there. And the challenge that we all have is, can we bring that within ourselves and can we tap into that within other people?
Mike, I want to take this opportunity to thank you, man, for digging so deep within yourself to be able to go there and actually unpack that actually we are all in this together, and the things that you're feeling, just that vulnerability that you have to go in there and go, actually, do you guys feel like this too? And oh my God, actually, you guys do. And actually bearing witness to that on that journey and just the work that you've been doing on yourself so that actually we all can also feel seen and heard in all of our neuroses almost. I don't want to call it neuroses, but
Yes.
in our humanness, really, in our humanness. And yeah, man, the prayer that you're carrying, really, really, really grateful for it. And the places that it's reaching and the way you're weaving it is an absolute inspiration. So thank you, not just for today's conversation, brother, but also the work that you've put into today's conversation. Really, really, really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all your energy. It's really beautiful.
Guys, the links to, we're all in this together will be in the show notes below. I'll link some of the other books too, because they're all amazing. But yeah, then check that one out. It's the most recent one. And on behalf of myself and the Inspired Evolution Tribe, the collective that we've got brewing here in Australia, across the world, brother, wishing you all the best on your journey. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, leave us a comment. And if you want to stay in tune for new episodes launching every Monday, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay inspired to evolve.